Today for Primer, I'm talking to James Plunkett. James has been a policy advisor to Number 10, helped run one of the UK's leading think tanks, and he's now Director of Design, Data and Technology for Citizens Advice. He's also the author of End State, won The Guardian's Political Books of the Year. In his book, James explores 9 big social problems and 9 radical ideas to put things right. But what he says he's really interested in is the project these ideas are a part of. How do we upgrade the state so it's capable of governing a 21st century economy? Here's our primer with James Plunkett. So James, welcome to Primer. I want to start with a very intriguing episode near the start of the book, where you've been invited to join a discussion in the garden at Number 10 between Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister, famously technocratic, very much a product of 20th century government, and Tim Berners-Lee, the father of the internet. What's being discussed?
Yeah, it was kind of the moment I had the idea that then slowly kind of gestated and led to the book. And it was the topic was, I think, opening up government data so that it could be used, by companies and so on. And I think that kind of faded from view. But the thing that stuck with me was more the almost the image, the disconnect between the way they both spoke about the problem. And as you say, you had sitting in the garden, slightly odd setting on these wicker chairs on a spring day, and we had Gordon Brown on my left and Tim Berners-Lee on my right. And I just remember being really struck by the different language almost that they were speaking. So you had Brown talking about what levers can we pull to solve this problem. I think at one point he said, how do we beat the Americans on this agenda, Tim? And Berners-Lee, who anyone who's heard him speak will know, speaks sort of buzzes to the language of the internet. He was speaking about networks, about platforms, and it just struck me that it was a different logic, and they were speaking to a different logic. And I left feeling not quite able to place that, but feeling uneasy and feeling like this idea of a disconnect or a kind of widening gap between the way government functions and thinks and the way the economy functions might become, a bigger problem in coming years.
So we've got this public policy settlement, which has worked fantastically for us for the last 150 years. But you're arguing is increasingly running on the wrong set of assumptions. We've got a economy that's changing radically, and we've got a state that doesn't seem to have got the memo.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, and I talk a lot about the Industrial Revolution in my book, which I think is analogous in some helpful ways to the digital revolution as it's playing out. And largely the kind of argument is that in response to the Industrial Revolution and the new type of economy that emerged at that time in the mid-19th century, we built a whole set of governing arrangements to deal with the problems that manifested from that economy. So we built the welfare state as we know it today, social insurance mechanisms to protect people when they fall sick, for example, free education, healthcare, public sewers. I talk about in the book, there wasn't such a need for public sewage systems when people didn't live in big cities, and that need emerged very visibly in the mid-19th century as sewage piled up. And so we built public sewer systems.
And they were a dangerous and radical invention.
When they first emerged, people dismissed them as a danger, as an act of overreach by the government. And so these radical ideas took shape and then became a new common sense for how you govern an industrial economy. And that took a long time. It took upwards of a century to build those institutions as we know them today. But largely speaking, we're still living with that state, right? That is still the state as we know it, designed to respond to that economy. And of course, now what's happening is a new kind of economy is emerging that functions in a deeply different way. And so those industrial era mechanisms are just unfit for the kind of problems that we see now.
So can you give me a practical example of that widening gap between the state and the economy?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is about pace. The pace at which things move. So if you take an example of, let's say someone who's on a 0 hours contract or one of these very flexible kinds of employment, maybe working in the gig economy, who suddenly gets zeroed down. So they're sort of maybe technically still employed, but suddenly they've got no income. or maybe their income has dipped for whatever reason via Uber or something, one of those platforms. It takes 5 weeks to get your income on universal credit, Britain's main welfare system now. And by that point, you might be back. Your hours might be back up again. And so these kind of bureaucratic systems that we built, in that case for welfare, where they were designed for a world where you fell sick, and so you applied for benefits, and it took time to come through, but then you were okay for a few years or a year, and then you move back into work. They just don't move at the pace that we need. Lots of examples as well of just where we're not using the full power of new tech. So in healthcare, for example, in education, many of these different examples where we're sort of still running public services on that kind of big kind of corporate bureaucratic model, hierarchical model of the 20th century, and where it's not a coincidence that tech companies don't work like that anymore. So, how do we bring some of those methods into the way we run the state?
There's a really interesting section in the book where you talk, and this is interesting to me because I've worked a lot in this area. You talk about how we fix the gap, the skills gap, especially for adults, between the old sort of industrial age jobs and the new types of jobs and skills that people are going to need to be gainfully employed, earn a living, feel pride in what they're doing. Can you maybe use that as an example of practically how policy and public service designers might think about a problem like that now?
Yeah, so I think this question of, we have these huge skills shortages in response to this, the new economy that's emerging, and the education system fundamentally, although we talk a lot about lifelong learning and politicians often give speeches about lifelong learning, really our education system is still based on the paradigm of, educate kids when they're young, that prepares them for life, and then they go into the labour market and work their way through. If anything, if there is adult skills training, it happens with your existing employer, so we kind of rely on the employer to do that. With the pace of change at the moment, I write in the book that a kid who starts school now won't retire until the 2080s. So the idea that we can kind of train a kid now for what is in store in decades' time with the pace of change, I think it's just not going to happen. So you have to think seriously about ongoing retraining, giving people access to these skills, and so partly that's a big shift in the way we think about education in that case, from this kind of prepare us when we're young to genuine lifelong learning. But I think it's also policymaking just needs to become much more agile, for want of a better word, just much quicker in responding to change. And these kind of very slow cycles of change in policymaking and public service design, where we design a settlement and then that's the settlement for a decade or more. That just does not equip us for the pace of change that we're seeing these days.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Can you talk a bit more about what agile policy making might look like?
Yeah, so I think I've been thinking a lot about the linear processes by which we make policy and also design and implement public service reform often. That, again, this is from the industrial paradigm of thinking about government, that we have a sort of pre-digital way of thinking about policy making, where we'll identify a problem, we'll do some research to work out what the solution might be to that problem. We might consult in a quite formal way and say, what do people think about this proposal, through a green paper. That becomes a white paper. Then if we can find time, through a Queen's speech, we legislate. That then is not quite written on vellum anymore, but we still wrap the law, I think, in vellum. So the idea that the law, once it's passed, is then sort of stuck for a long time. And as anyone who works in digital will know, that linear, if you like, waterfall way of solving problems is just not quick enough in terms of its cycles of iteration and learning. And so when I talk about agile policy making and agile public service design, it's lifting a lot of the principles that will be familiar with people from digital work. So, can you embed people into teams that have all the disciplines you need, so that you've got policy folk working alongside stats people, digital people, delivery people to solve a problem? Can you have quicker cycles of learning, so that you're not having this very linear process, but you're trying something out, seeing if it works, changing it, if it doesn't. And I think those ways of thinking about policy making, certainly in the policy side of things, are still relatively experimental in Whitehall. There are some examples of that emerging, but by and large, the system is still this kind of linear and painfully slow system that just doesn't learn quickly enough in the kind of environment we're now in.
There's a very interesting phrase in the book where you say that the politics of 2050 are rooted in ideas that are already with us. So, and you talked a bit about what those sort of ideas, but just talk a bit more about that. What are these ideas that are going to form our politics in 2-3 decades?
Yeah, I have this. The book's very optimistic, and despite everything, I feel very optimistic about our potential to respond to this challenge. I think one of the things that's fascinating is just how slow the process of change is. But one of the things that means is that ideas emerge, and it takes them a long time to become the new common sense, as I think Carlota Perez uses this phrase, the economic historian. And I borrow that in the book because I love this concept that an idea emerges, and at first it's seen as radical, unaffordable, dangerous, and then over the course of decades that becomes a new common sense. And it's bizarre that once those ideas become common sense, we then act as if they always were common sense, and we immediately forget they were ever seen as radical. And this happened with ideas we now think of as completely accepted. So free education, public sewers is a great example. When public sewers were first suggested, people said it was an act of dangerous government overreach, and it was the thin end of a wedge. And then of course it was accepted as necessary. So it's fascinating, I think, because that means that there are ideas with us right now as we speak that are currently seen as dangerously radical and unaffordable, that in 20 or 30 years' time will make up the new state, if you like, will be the common sense. So I give it in the book in a way as a kind of a search for what those ideas are. So I talk about the 4-day week as a good example, kind of emerging before our eyes as a kind of starting to gain acceptance.
I love it in the book. You say that the weekend is such a great idea. We forgot we invented it.
Completely amazing that we forget that. We act like the weekend is just a natural thing. That Saturday and Sunday are just time off. That was just not the case. We had a 6-day working week in the 1870s and before, and the 2-day weekend was an incredibly radical concept. And people said it would bankrupt manufacturing when it was mooted. And then, of course, we just act like that's always been the case. And so I think the 4-day week is in exactly that vein, that people say this is kind of daft. Yeah, this is economically doesn't add up. And my guess is it we're seeing now it become a new kind of norm. But it's fascinating, I think. So it's both that there are policy ideas out there like 4-day week, basic income I explore in the book as another radical idea.
James, talk about that. So UBI, Universal Basic Income, for those who don't know the phrase, just explain what it is first.
Yeah, so the basic income, and I have to, I'm not entirely a convert to this idea yet because it's a particularly radical one, but the idea is that instead of having this rather kind of labyrinthine benefit system that we've created, that we built in response to the industrial economy, where at the moment the benefit system is you could argue highly bureaucratic. It's obviously all about targeting money. There's lots of means testing, as they call it. So you have to jump through lots of hoops, lots of process. The universal basic income says, let's scrap the complexity and let's essentially universally give people money as a kind of base level of security. And so everyone would get a modest income from the state, and that would almost underwrite their lives, if that makes sense. And so you would have that confidence that even if you fell on hard times or became sick, you would have that there. And people who advocate it say that it's less stigmatizing, for example, because you don't have the sort of benefit claimant kind of stigma that we have at the moment. It's less complex. It works better with digital jobs, where obviously people can move very quickly, 0-hour contracts, be zeroed down, and income goes up and down very quickly. And so the argument is that maybe actually what we need to build now is that sort of simplicity and clarity and security for people in an economy that is so turbulent and so insecure. Maybe that's what we need now, rather than this very technocratic kind of benefit system.
Yeah, and there are sort of there have been studies. There's been a study in Norway, hasn't there? There have been studies done around the world in states and nations, kind of inconclusive, but there are suggestions that, for instance, it could just be in terms of the costs, the sort of the second order costs of things like welfare, the justice system. You could potentially dramatically reduce them just by giving people that fundamental level of security.
Yeah, and the surprising result that comes out of a lot of the studies is that obviously people assume that there'd be a work incentive effect, as the kind of economists would put it, that people, once they had this income, would say, well, it's not worth working anymore. And what you tend to find in the studies is that doesn't transpire in the way people think, and actually people use the extra security to maybe move jobs more often, or to retrain, because they have that kind of cushion there. And so actually people make quite positive choices in their lives on the basis of that security, in a way that people currently, that kind of, if you like, the fear-based benefit system we have at the moment, that's based on we will sanction you if you don't do the right thing, doesn't lead people to make those kind of positive choices in their lives. So it's a fascinating one. And as I say, I'm not fully a convert because of the it's much less targeted. Arguably, it's much less good for the very poorest because it spreads money much more thinly. But certainly, it's kind of gaining momentum. And could that be an idea that over the next 20 or 30 years takes centre stage? It's not completely impossible, I would say.
Yeah. So, I mean, on the face of it, it sounds nuts, doesn't it? And the people are probably rightly wary about trying this out at population scale. But maybe we can come back to the effect of the pandemic a bit later. But I think it's very interesting that you've got what sort of digital folks would think of as a UBI alpha that's just happened at population scale. So during the pandemic, you had the furlough scheme in the UK. In the US, you've got the federal government cutting every family in the union a cheque for $3,000. Looks quite a lot like UBI, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's fascinating. I think often crises, the way that you react in a crisis tells you quite a lot about the way you should be behaving more, all the time, if that makes sense. And I think the other thing that's fascinating, the way that we found that actually the benefit system wasn't particularly well equipped to deal with a crisis of that magnitude. And for example, one reason the government ended up being relatively universalist in America as well was that it was hard to make sure you reached everyone with the current benefit system. You might have left out self-employed people, for example, and so on. And so often governments reached for that simpler, if you like, tool, as you say, kind of almost like an alpha of a basic income. The other thing I find fascinating about the response to the pandemic is that we were actually quite agile in some ways. I'm particularly interested in the regular press conferences that were given, which
show and tells.
You could criticise in some senses, but they were almost show and tells. And this image of having the prime minister or the policymaker, the minister, flanked by civil servants, presenting live data on outcomes, and saying, what we're going to do about that, and then being quizzed by the press and the public directly, by users of those services, on why are you doing that? Why aren't you doing more? I mean, that is almost like a retro or a show and tell. It's directly drawn from digital methods, and I think actually one of the great shames is we've kind of now scrapped those, and there's been this sort of itching to get back to business as usual. But it tells us a lot, I think, the way that we respond to crisis. You sort of think, maybe that's how we should be acting a bit more, more often in policy work.
Yeah. So there's a at the end of the book, there's a lovely image where you talk about these bold policy ideas and interventions that we just had to roll out at speed during the pandemic, being put back behind the safety glass. Is a crisis a terrible thing to waste?
Yeah, I think I'm fascinated by the role of crisis in change, and the metaphor I often use is change moves like a mudslide, in the sense that you get this in the Industrial Revolution. This absolutely happened. Build up of social problems, accumulating frustration, often populism emerges because of this kind of sense of why aren't you solving this stuff, kind of that piles up at kind of politicians' doors. And so you get this accumulation of mud, if you like, on the hillside of unresolved social problems. No one can predict, if you like, the rainstorm that will then unleash the mudslide. And it's really hard to call, will it be the financial crisis that unlocks great change? Will it be the pandemic? But what everyone can tell is that at some point the mud's going to have to come running down the hill. At some point there will be the trigger, if you like, for the social change. In Britain, obviously, the big emblematic example is the Second World War, where you had this kind of accumulated sense of the need for change. And obviously after the Second World War, with the Beveridge settlement and the NHS, you had radical change coming through that was solving problems that had been building up since the 20s and the 30s. So this wasn't, these were problems that had been there for a long time. But the war created somehow the conditions that made that possible and that made the politics align. I think partly in a crisis, people see what's possible. And the pandemic, people looked at government and said, well, if we can solve this thing, surely we can solve some other big problems in our lives. But, at the moment, you asked the question of, are we wasting the crisis? At the moment, it does seem unclear, doesn't it? I think, are we going to use the pandemic to affect social change, or are we going to put everything back in the box and, if you like, wait for the next crisis to come along?
There's a very intriguing phrase in the book where you say that for some of these bold, crazy ideas, UBI, 4-day work week, lowering the voting age, the political ambiguity of them is reassuring. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that I talk in the book about this big struggle for reform. And I think it's easy to think that's a struggle of left versus right, because that tends to be how we frame, obviously, big political arguments. When you look at the big moments of reform in history, I actually think often it's not a left versus right struggle so much as a kind of, whether the future versus the past, however you want to frame it, but it's kind of a dogmatist versus reformers. It's often that way. And actually a lot of the biggest reformers in history, they're not all from the left or from the right. People like Teddy Roosevelt, who were kind of quite hard to place on the political spectrum, Keynes, like these kind of big reforming intellectuals or politicians, I think not by coincidence, it's quite hard to say were they of the left or of the right. And in a way, the real power they had to reform was that they were quite unencumbered, actually. They weren't dogmatic. And so they weren't carrying, the kind of weight and the kind of, they weren't carrying all of those outdated ideas with them, arguably. And so I do think it's interesting, if you look at basic income, even 4-day week, arguably, where would you put those ideas on the political spectrum? The basic income has real advocates from libertarians on the right and
Andrew Yang,
people on the left. Yeah. And so I think that's quite reassuring in a sense, in that probably the ideas that will emerge and become that new common sense aren't going to be your sort of checklist of the left's manifesto, and probably also aren't going to be a checklist of the right, because in a way, left versus right is itself quite an outdated kind of way of thinking about things at a time like this. And so these new surprising ideas will emerge that have surprising supporters, and I think we should sort of have our eyes out for those ideas.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting watching the French elections and watching Macron. So he's kind of he's set out his stall to dominate the middle ground, but he's not doing that in a sort of traditional Biden-esque way of being moderate, promising to reach across the aisle. He's quite capable of, on the same day, announcing some sort of dog whistle thing for the left and doing it for the right. So, he might say something that is very popular with the left-wing media, but then almost immediately go on a rant about immigration or something. And I wonder, and same probably with Le Pen, actually, you've got this thing, apparently very progressive manifesto with a sort of hard right agenda under it. And I wonder if what there is instinctive politicians are sensing is that the electorate are no longer interested in left versus right, traditional versus, progressive versus conservative. They're interested in issues that they feel are pressing and relevant for them right now.
Yeah, I think you get, things are in flux. You get kind of much more movement between those different old categories. I think that's true, and you do get. I mean, obviously with Le Pen and Trump and so on, you get the emergence of populism because there is this sense of frustration of the system isn't working, and on some level people are right about that kind of instinct of something's not right here, and old solutions aren't going to work. And obviously the problematic place that then goes is to kind of this is to a populist and a kind of almost like a burn it down agenda. But likewise there's sort of energy latent in that frustration, if that makes sense, that can be harnessed. And at times in history where we manage to harness that energy for reform, I think that's the power, is kind of, can you harness that energy behind that kind of whatever you call it, radical centrist, radical reform agenda to reform the system in the way that it needs to be reformed.
Yeah. So James, let's try and put this together. So we've got let's imagine that we're a civil servant or a public servant designing policy or public services, and we find ourselves in a moment, a sort of transitional moment, maybe a paradigm shift, where all of a sudden it's become apparent that the old way of doing government no longer works with a radically changing economy, where the old certainties of left and right are seemingly no longer as relevant, which maybe opens up opportunity for change, where we've got these pandemic, possibly the next pandemic fairly shortly afterwards, these crises happening at an increasing rate, which maybe give people the permission to be more agile, to do radical things very quickly. As that public servant or civil servant or person working in the third sector, how do you cut through? How do you make a contribution?
Yeah, I think this is a fascinating question. How do you do policy work if you buy that we're living in a technological revolution, if you like, if we're living in this great transition? How do you do policy work at a time like that? I think,
or service design or
public service design. How do you reimagine the state? Because I think fundamentally, these are sort of ugly words, but I think of the phrase institutional architecture. It's kind of the institutions. We need new institutions, and we need to reimagine old ones.
Yeah, you talk about upgrading the state, which I think is a great way of articulating it.
Yeah, so it's not incrementalist, and I think this is one thing that I'm quite interested in is if you like, the standard ways we think about the standard methods of policy work and public service design are not particularly well suited to that bigger task of institutional redesign or reimagining of the state. Partly, I think we became very technocratic, I guess, if you kind of think of like the dominant way of thinking about policy in the late 90s was pretty technocratic, very dependent on economics, for example. So almost all the kind of main methodologies were methodologies of economics, kind of cost-benefit analysis or the business case process, these kind of methods. And my instinct is actually we need to sort of break out of some of those technocratic economic shackles. It's interesting, I think, when you look at some of the biggest debates in history at the time of the Industrial Revolution, they were really debates about ethics and about philosophy and about what kind of society we need. I have this slightly glib phrase in the book where I write that we didn't ban child labour on the basis of a cost-benefit analysis. That's just not how these debates play out, right? You ask, what's the right thing to do here? And then you make the economics work. And interestingly, actually, Keynes has this great phrase that at times like this, you don't start with the economics, you start with ethics, and then you bring in the economics to work it through. And so I do think there's something for all of us, public service designers, delivery folk, and policy folk, about bringing in the ethics and even bringing in philosophy to some degree, bringing in different disciplines, beyond economics. I think is really interesting. I think also just incrementalism won't cut it at a time like this. So how do you make sure you're asking big enough questions about policy, and not just assuming that we'll need to work within the existing categories or levers? So how do you go deeper? I sometimes say that the work goes all the way down, You can't just kind of be working in the surface layers of this thing. You've got to sort of think deeply about the institutions themselves. And yeah, that means breaking out into new methods, new ways of doing policy work.
So, I mean, you've been an advisor at Number 10. You've worked at Cabinet Office. For the folk who are trying to pull different levers or work in a different way, but are still having to do that under the authority of ministers and advisors and private office, how do you think they can persuade the political class to give them that freedom?
Yeah, this is a great question, because I think when you talk to people in these roles, and I've been in some of these roles, they talk about battling the system, and this sense that the system and the conditions around people trying to do this work make it harder. Like the system that should be there to create the conditions in which this work is done is the thing that is making it hard to do the work, because you're trying to redesign the system, and systems don't like being redesigned. And so it's not a coincidence, I think, that a lot of the best work that has happened so far in public digital work, for example, public service redesign, has been where people have created, often kind of very good leaders have created bubbles where they've protected teams from the system around them, actually, and have kind of created these different bubbles within a department or within government digital service in the early days. And so, how do we get past that, where we're not having to create small bubbles, I think is fascinating. I think a lot of this, it's not a coincidence that a lot of those principles of digital work, like working in the open, the principle around show, don't tell, I think is really powerful. And I do think at a time of change like this, building a small example of the new thing and then pointing at it, this familiar method from digital work, is much more powerful than trying to just make an argument for why things need to change. So I think actually quite a lot of this is about just making more routine use of those kind of principles for good digital work and lifting those principles into policy work as well. Because I think the methods of policy work are increasingly similar to the methods of good digital work and good public service delivery.
Yeah, and I mean, I've observed a super brave deputy director pushing back on the education secretary and the chancellor because he was being presented with user research from real citizens, and I think there's probably a transition, isn't there, where leaders are going to have to, like you say, create those bubbles around teams and protect them and allow them to do that work.
Yeah, and at some point, I think it has to flip at some point. So there's a whole phase where it's sort of under the radar, right? So you kind of try to get away with doing work like this, and at some point we have to confront, and that's a good example of, at some point you have to confront the minister or the permanent secretary to say, you are asking the wrong question. Like, you are asking the wrong question, or you are creating conditions that are not conducive to good work. And I do think we're starting in some cases to get to that point. And of course, it's not a coincidence as well that as people who are more native to this way of thinking move up through the civil service, you start to get people in leadership who get it and who are there to create these conditions. It takes time, that kind of thing. There's this kind of, the phrasing of science progresses one funeral at a time, which is kind of trying to speak to this point about paradigm shifts. And I sometimes think politics progresses one retirement at a time, or one firing at a time. But so to some degree, this needs to work its way through. But I do think increasingly the onus is on reformers, if you like, to have the argument, to have that conversation about how do we need to work, rather than this sort of getting beyond the kind of flying below the radar phase, if you like.
So, James, you're talking about these exciting new ideas and perspectives with your hat on as a cultural commentator and author. But you've also got a day job, a very important day job, as Director of Design, Data and Technology at Citizens Advice. So with your Citizens Advice hat on, can you talk to me about the work you and your teams are doing there?
Yeah, I mean, and it's in a similar space. And one of the things I love about about the day job is that I can see these things playing out in practice, as they're applied in the full complexity of organisational change, as many of the listeners will appreciate, and then zoom out and think about the kind of the historical sweep, if you like, of the ideas. I think, like so many organisations, the challenge we have is Citizens Advice was a service founded upwards of 80 years ago. It was founded in response to the outbreak of World War II, actually, in 1939. And is a magnificent institution, such an important institution in British life. And for people who don't know, it's founded to give free advice to people, no conditions, turn up and we'll help you with your problems, mostly on issues like debt and applying for benefits and so on, and obviously cost of living challenges at the moment in Britain. And there's so many incredible strengths from the history of the organisation, the way that we're run, the way that we're a network of local charities, so we're decentralised in the way we deliver our services, the brand, the incredible brand that we have, for example, and the trust that people place in that brand. And at the same time, of course, the way in which we deliver our service has changed unrecognisably in some ways. And in the course of the pandemic, obviously we had to pivot almost overnight away from physical face-to-face advice to giving entirely remote advice via the phone, via video, via email and so on. And of course our website has had more hits in the last couple of years than it's ever had in the history of our service. So that question of how do you reimagine a service like that without losing the value of its history and kind of the legacy as well is incredibly interesting. It's all of the lessons from great digital work. It's all about people. It's all about culture. It's not about the technology. And what we've done is tried to take, I guess, a lot of the lessons from the government digital service in the UK and other digital reform in government, but try and explore how you could adapt those for a third sector setting. And I do think there's a very interesting question about what is the methodology of digital work in the third sector that might be somewhat distinct from the method in government. So, for example, we put, I think, an even stronger emphasis on accessibility and inclusivity and the diversity of the teams that we build in the work that we do. We think really hard about things like compassion in the way in which we interact with the public. And so it's not just about scale, it's not about reach, it's about the humanity of the interaction, for example, even if that's a remote interaction or an interaction via our website. And I just think there's a whole bunch of fascinating questions for charities about the means by which charities apply technology in a way that makes their services more accessible rather than less. But it's a work in progress, as it is in all big complex organisations.
Yeah, there's I think a fascinating thing in there where you talk about, if I'm getting it right, you're talking about, this may be a bit of a reductive way of thinking about it, but essentially building compassion into the service design.
Yeah,
because government doesn't really do that. Government has to be neutral and authoritative at all times. But like you said, in a third sector setting, you've got to think about that in a bit of a different way. So can you give an example of how you build compassion into the service design?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and it's about the nature of the relationship between us and the people who need us, who use our service. And I think some of it is about, and this is familiar, I think, in government work, is about how do you design an empowering service? So how do you design a service that unlocks the potential that is within communities, for example? So we don't do things to people. We provide a way in which volunteers can, through our service, give advice to other people in their community. So it's partly about seeing it in those kind of in those terms from the start. I also think, as you say, there's something about a charity can have a different kind of relationship with a person than a government can, I think, necessarily, in some sense. And we always, in a way, we're by the person's side, working with them, as opposed to kind of interacting transactionally with them like a government might. So a lot of our advice, for example, is it's not information, it's tactics. It's helping people think through, in this circumstance, what kind of things might you want to do next, and equipping people to leave with a sense of agency and a sense of, I'm just always struck when you walk into a local citizens advice, what you see is people come in tense, and there's a sense in which people leave with their shoulders a little more relaxed, that they know they find a way forward, is the way that we put it. And I think there's something just really interesting about that interaction, the nature of that partnership, where you're sort of empowering, working with people, giving people the tools to leverage the rights they already have. Because a lot of our work is about helping people to realize they have more power than they realized when they walked in. And when they walk out, they realize they have that power. And it's fascinating. And that is, I think, a different kind of relationship than you can have between the state and a citizen.
So, James, what's next? Another book?
Yeah, I think, big question. I think I'm thinking a lot about these questions. I think I don't know the answer is one thing at all. I think no one does yet. I'm not even sure we have that good a grasp on the problem. And I think one thing I'm quite committed to doing, because I think it's so important at a time like this, is just trying to make sense of what's going on. So my first book was partly about just trying to describe what's happening, to make sense of it, and also partly about hope, because this is the other kind of thing I'm very committed to, is personally I feel very optimistic about all of this. It's very easy to get gloomy given the scale of what's needed, but when I read hit the history of change, actually my big takeaway is we can do this. We've been here before, and we can do it again. So I'm thinking about how do I help inject some more optimism and hope into these debates? How do I help make sense of it, create spaces in which people can talk about these things and bring clarity to these kind of ideas, and maybe a second book at the right time. Yeah.
Well, it's very much needed. I've really enjoyed End State. I think it's certainly one of my books of the year. Where can people find out about more about you and the book?
Yeah, so the book, I should say, my agent will kill me if I don't say, the book is out in paperback, came out very recently. So if you Google End State, and I'm sure that will come up, all good bookshops. Twitter is the main platform I use, so James T. Plunkett on Twitter, and follow me there. And I've got a Medium blog as well, so I made a slightly foolhardy commitment to publish a blog a week throughout the whole course of this year, on the question of how do we govern the future. So similar themes we've been talking about. So yeah, follow me on Medium as well.
Thanks, James Plunkett.